Hi, my name is John Huynh, and I work in the Faith Journey office for the Diocese of Des Moines. I've been asked to give you my reflection and thoughts on today's Gospel from St. Matthew, chapter 22. So I'll read the passage first, and then I'll give you some of the thoughts that were running through my mind as I sat and prayed this passage. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." My first thought on this passage, there's an inherent paradox going on here. There is a command to love, but how do you make sense of commanding a free act? Love, after all, in order for it to be valuable, is supposed to be free. If it's commanded, it's not necessarily free, and it's almost like that song Love Fool, right, by the Cardigans. Love me, say that you love me, fool me, go on and fool me. It's like that. It's not done freely, and it's almost to appease the beloved rather than a valuable act inherent to the lover. So is there any value in it? Well, Christianity is filled with paradoxes. Ross Douthat, in his book called Bad Religion, has a fairly interesting assessment of Christianity and paradox. And I'd like to read that quote to you in full. "Christianity is a paradoxical religion because the Jew of Nazareth is a paradoxical character. No figure in history or fiction contains as many multitudes as the New Testament's Jesus. He's a celibate ascetic who enjoys dining with publicans and changing water into wine at weddings. He's an apocalyptic prophet one moment, a careful and wise ethicist the next. He promises to set spouses and one another and parents against children, and then disallows divorce. He consorts with prostitutes while denouncing even the lustful thoughts. He can be egalitarian and hierarchical, gentle and impatient, extraordinarily charitable and extraordinarily judgmental. He sets impossible standards and then forgives the worst of sinners. He blesses the peacemakers and then promises that he's brought not peace, but the sword. He's superhuman one moment, the next he's weeping." But Douthat concludes that there's a reasonability to this. There's an intelligibility to the paradoxes. He writes, "The boast of Christian orthodoxy, as codified by the councils of the early church and expounded in the creeds, has always been its fidelity to the whole Jesus," where heresy says which one. Both says orthodoxy. The goal of the great heresies, on the other hand, has been often to extract from the tensions of the gospel narratives a more consistent, streamlined, and non-contradictory Jesus. We see this in the Christological heresies, right? The Docetists, who say that Christ was fully God, only appearing to be human. And then there are the Arians, who says, no, Jesus Christ was fully human, not at all God. And the Orthodox position that comes out of this is that while there's a paradox between fully divine and fully human, Jesus Christ embodies both. And so how do we make sense of this commandment to love, to command a free act? If we realize that we are created in the image and likeness of God, to command us to love is to command us to be true to ourselves, to return to the deepest part of our heart's desires, to want to be with God. As St. Augustine says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O God." And so, while it seems paradoxical that God commands a free act, he is actually setting us free by commanding us to do so, because he wants us to return to the very essence of who we are. So while there seems to be tension, there seems to be a paradox in commanding love, it is rather God's way of setting us free. And what follows naturally from this commandment to love God is to love neighbor. Because once we recognize the depth of God's love for us and God's own willingness to go the mile, if you will, to forgive the gravest of sins if we are truly sorry for them, truly repentant of them, then we realize that we too can love others in that same way. And so Jesus reminds us of this through the story of the Good Samaritan. So in the Good Samaritan, the man is heading to Jericho from Jerusalem and gets robbed and gets beaten up and left for dead. And we're told that several people went by him. The first two were religious people, people whom others thought would gladly help, but they went on their way. The last person whom people would not have thought to be a person that would provide help, a Samaritan who is despised by the Jews at the time, renders help. And so we're called to enter into that story not as the Samaritan, I think, but as the person who is hurt. If you are hurt and a Samaritan, someone who you despise, provides aid, what would you do? Would you be thankful or would you be upset? And if you were the hurt person, would you want that help? And I think we all would say that we would. And so Jesus makes it a point then there. Love others as you would have yourself loved. The second thought that crossed my mind is that this is a positive commandment. And because it's a positive commandment, it's not a measurable one. It's almost easier had God said, fear me, fear God. It's almost easier to fear God than to love God. And the reason I say that is because it's a lot easier to measure what you can't do than what you're expected to do. So for instance, don't murder. Well, pretty easy. You just go through life. Make sure you don't murder someone. Don't tell a lie. Right? Don't bear false witness. But it's the positive commandment that becomes difficult. It's because everything can be measured and filled. Everything except the heart. How do we fill our heart with God? How is that measurable? Well, it's not measurable. And I think this is part of the wisdom of God, right? But he does give us hints on how to do this. Because the prepositions that follow give us pretty good clues on how to love God. He says, with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. The Gospels consistently tell us where your heart is where your treasure is. And conversely, where your treasure is where your heart is. In other words, where is our priority? Our priorities indicate where our hearts are. For instance, my family is a great priority to me. And so I plan things, my daily lives around my family, my children, my wife. Some of us prioritize work, some prioritize sporting events, some prioritize friendships. God is asking for us to prioritize God over anything else. And not just Sundays. This is the thing. We tend to think, yeah, I can prioritize God on Sundays. I can make everything else surround the Mass, surround the time that I'm supposed to be at church. I can make sure that happens. But that's not what God is saying. If something is prioritized in your life, then it becomes a constant priority. It becomes a constant priority. Is God part of our daily priority? Are we making sure that we are spending time in prayer with God? How do you love someone that you do not know? And how would you get to know someone unless you spend time with that person? So in order to be friends of Christ, we have to spend time with him. We have to get to know Him in prayer. And the next preposition, with our mind, learning more about the other, directing our rational capacity to seek out God not only in our neighbors but in creation. So certainly we can will ourselves to learn and discern God in the world. The third preposition, with all of our soul. When we're talking about our soul, we're talking about our entire being, to pour our being into something. Have you ever taken on a task and you sort of half-heartedly did the task, and whatever, you finished it, not a big deal. You finished it, you're happy you finished it. But if you pour your soul into a task to do something, you've made it a project with all, in some sense, with all your being. It sounds serious, but that really is. I mean, you can pour your entire soul into a work, some sort of work, be it sculpting, be it drawing, be it writing something, be it a project. You pour your entire being into it. And once you've accomplished it, how good do you feel about that? It's because you've committed your entire being to it. And so God is asking us then to commit our entire being to God, to prioritize God, to learn to discern of God in His creation, and to pour our entire being into God. That's how we can love God. But this isn't an easy task. It's not something like we can just do by ourselves. It requires grace. It requires us to ask for grace to do it. And so the genius, of course, the wisdom behind God's commandment to love God and neighbor is that in desiring to do that, in desiring to fulfill that commandment, we have nowhere to turn but God. How do I love God more? I got to ask for the grace. How do I ask for the grace? I got to sit down, talk to God, and ask for grace. So this is how we fulfill those two great commandments. And so those are a couple of thoughts that came to my mind as I was reading and praying over this. I hope that also helps you in your prayer and your reflection on this reading. Please keep me, our Catholic schools, and our diocese in your prayers. Thanks.